everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today I have a mega spring video for you. I'm sharing 23 of my spring projects from here on my channel. Since this is a combination of all of my spring DIYs put together, just keep in mind that they will be numbered a little bit out of order. Now let's get right into the spring DIYs. The first DIY I'll be sharing is a colander succulent planter, and for this project I used a mini colander. This one I got from Dollar General, but they do have these also at Dollar Tree. Mini faux succulents from Dollar Tree and also Amazon. Waverly chalk paint in plaster and also in the color steel. Paintbrushes, floral foam, scissors, nautical rope from Dollar Tree, rocks from Dollar Tree, Spanish moss, reindeer moss, and also my hot glue gun. For this project, I started by painting my colander with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. I did have to do 3 different coats of paint to get all of this teal color covered up. I do really like the teal color, but I wanted to have a little bit more of a neutral color to go with the decor that I currently have in my home. And to get in all of the little holes that are in the colander, I just dabbed my paintbrush right over them to get the paint down in there. Once that paint was dry, I then took my Dollar Tree stencil brush and my Waverly chalk paint in the color steel, and I dry brushed that on top of the entire colander to give it more of a rustic look. Now that I have my colander all painted, I'm then placing a piece of floral foam inside of my colander to give me a little bit of height so I don't have to use as much reindeer and Spanish moss when filling it up. I then took the reindeer and Spanish moss and just kind of mixed them together before placing them inside of the colander, and I placed it around the floral foam and over top as well. Next, I'm adding some succulents that I picked up from Dollar Tree and also from Amazon right inside of that Spanish and reindeer moss. The ones I picked up from Amazon do have stems on them, so I just placed those stems right inside of that floral foam. And the ones that I got from Amazon also have a coating on them. They're great quality, but when I first received them, I took each one out of their packaging and threw them in with my crafting supplies, and they got thrown around a lot, so some of the coating did come off of these. Next, I'm adding some of these rocks that I also picked up from Dollar Tree. I'm placing them around all of the succulents and just sticking them down in between all of the Spanish moss. I thought they would add a really cute touch to my succulent planter. Now I'm making my hanger for my planter. I'm using a piece of nautical rope and I'm tying a knot around one of the handles. I then measured how long I wanted my hanger to be before I tied a knot around the other handle on the colander. Once I had everything all measured out and all of my knots tied, I cut the excess nautical rope off. I did have a little bit of trouble cutting the rope because I couldn't find my sharp scissors, and I ended up using some really dull kitchen scissors. So if you're going to be cutting nautical rope, be sure that you have some nice sharp scissors. It'll save you so much time. Here is my colander succulent planter all finished. This project was so easy and affordable to make, and it is perfect for spring and summer decor. Now moving on into DIY number 2, I'm making a moss stone wreath. For this project, I used an 8-inch wire wreath form, moss stones, reindeer moss, and then I also used Spanish moss, wood stems, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, paintbrushes, jute, a mini bird's nest that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. It is not from Dollar Tree, scissors, and my hot glue gun. For this project, I'm using the back side of this wire wreath form, so I just flipped it over, and then I started by putting these moss stones around the entire wreath form, and I didn't want the stones to go all in the same direction, so I'm placing them going in all different directions. Once I had my stones placed exactly where I want them to be, then I started by hot gluing them down. I placed hot glue right on the back side of each stone and then just pressed it right back down. I was sure to keep all of the stones in place where I had already placed them around my wreath form because I wanted them to sit exactly in those spots. Next, I'm adding some Spanish moss around all of the outside edges of the moss stones. And to do that, I'm placing hot glue around the outer edge and in between the moss stones, and then just pressing that Spanish moss onto the hot glue. I continued that step going around all of the outside edges of the moss stones, and then I also did that around all of the inside edges of the moss stones as well, until I had the Spanish moss going around my entire wreath. My Spanish moss was looking extremely messy, so I used some scissors to give it a little bit of a trim, and I did this around my entire wreath so that it would look a little bit more put together. Next, I'm attaching some of these wood stems to the bottom portion of my wreath. I'm putting hot glue right on the back side of the stem and then pressing it down onto my wreath. I did place them going in a few different directions. Once I had them all placed and glued exactly where I wanted them to be, I then attached this mini bird's nest that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. This is probably the only item I'm using that's not from Dollar Tree. And I placed hot glue on the back of that and then just pressed it over top of the wood stems. I'm cutting some small pieces of this raffia to give my bird's nest a little bit more of a realistic look. I put some hot glue in between all of the wood stems and all around the bird's nest, and then just put that raffia right over top of the glue to attach it. I also added some reindeer moss over top of that raffia right underneath all of the wood stems as well. For inside of my bird's nest, I added some Spanish moss using some hot glue once again, and then I added 2 of these mini eggs that I had in my craft stash, and I'm not exactly sure where these eggs came from. And then for the very last step, I'm adding 2 pieces of jute for my hanger. I just placed them right in between the wires along the back side of the wreath form, tied a knot for however long I want my hanger to be, and then just cut off the excess jute pieces. Here is my moss stone wreath all finished. This project was, again, super easy to do, and I think it looks so much more expensive than what it cost me to make it. And now for DIY number 3, I'll be doing potted flowers with a plant stand. For this one, I used a pack of the Tumbling Tower game blocks, a 5-inch terracotta pot, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, steel, and also in the color moss, paintbrushes, Spanish moss, reindeer moss, jute, floral foam, scissors, and also my hot glue gun. For this project, I started out by painting 14 of these Tumbling Tower game blocks from Dollar Tree with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, and I only had to do 1 coat of paint for each block. Next, I'm assembling the sides for my planter stand, and for each side I'm using 4 blocks. I'm placing hot glue on the sides of one of the blocks, and then I'm pressing 2 blocks on each side of that piece, and it's going to be towards the top. And then for the bottom piece, I'm doing the same thing. I'm putting hot glue on each end of the block, and then I'm pressing that in between the 2 other blocks at the bottom portion. I did continue that same step for 4 different sides. Once I had 4 of them made, I'm now going to be assembling my planter box, and for that I just put hot glue on the side of one of the pieces and then pressed it against another piece, and I continued that same step until I had all 4 sides completely all glued together. Now I'm making the bottom for my planter box, and I'm using large popsicle sticks for this, and I was measuring how long I need each popsicle stick to be to cover the bottom, and it ended up being just right in half. So I cut each popsicle stick in half, and I ended up needing 2.5 of them total to cover the entire bottom. And to cut the popsicle sticks, I just used some scissors. After I've got them all cut, I'm attaching them to the bottom of my planter. I'm using hot glue on the top and bottom portion of the popsicle stick and then placing it down onto my planter box. Once those are all glued down, I painted them with that Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to match the rest of my planter box. Now that I have my box all made, I'm moving on to my pot. For this, I'm using a 5-inch terracotta pot from Dollar Tree, obviously, and I'm painting that with that Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster once again, and I painted the entire pot this color, the bottom, and then even about an inch down on the inside of the pot. And I was kind of messy when painting this. I didn't need it to be completely covered in the paint because I am going to be using a few other paint colors as well. Once the plaster color is all dry, I'm then taking my Waverly paint in the color steel on a piece of paper towel, and I'm dabbing that over top of the entire pot. And then I'm taking a clean piece of paper towel and rubbing it over top of the steel color to give it a really messy, distressed aged look. Once that color is on, I'm then taking my moss colored chalk paint on a piece of paper towel, and I'm dabbing that over top of the other colors on the entire pot. And once I have it all dabbed on, I'm then rubbing the extra paint that's on the paper towel all over the pot. Next, I'm cutting these stems down a little bit from these floral pieces that I picked up from Dollar Tree. I did end up using some of these little white flowers. I believe these were from Michael's a while ago, but I mixed some of these white flowers in with the ones from Dollar Tree just to add a little bit of more color. I'm also cutting down this piece of floral foam to fit inside of my pot. I'm then placing each one of these little stems inside of the floral foam to hold them into place. Once I have them arranged exactly how I want them, I'm placing some of the Spanish moss around all of the flower stems. Before I add my pot to my planter stand, I did have to add 2 of these little tumbling tower blocks on each side at the very top to hold my pot into place nice and snug. Here is my potted plant and stand all finished. You could use these separately, not together. You could take the pot out and use the stand for other types of flowers. I think this one turned out beautifully. For the first DIY, I'll be making a pallet succulent garden. And for this project, I used 2 mini pallets from Dollar Tree, mini succulents that I got from Amazon, Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, folk art wood tint in the color gray, paintbrushes, Spanish moss from Dollar Tree, scissors, jute, and my hot glue gun. For this project, I started by painting both of my mini wood palettes with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, and I wasn't worried about painting in between the wood slats too much because you're not going to see those later on. And I did do 1 coat of paint on this, and then I also painted the back side of the wood palettes as well. Once that paint was completely dried, I then took some paper towel and my folk art wood tint in the color gray, and I just pretty much applied it like you would a stain, just wiped it on and then wiped the excess off. I wish I would have used like an old towel or something because the paper towel did kind of break up a little bit, so just keep that in mind if you're going to be doing this. It's better to use an old towel, not a paper towel. Once that wood tint has completely dried, I'm then taking some hot glue and applying it to the top edge of the bottom palette that I'm going to be using, and then I'm pressing the 2 palettes together to connect them, and I'm just holding them together until the glue has completely dried. Next, I'm adding some Spanish moss to my wood palette, and to do that, I placed hot glue right in between the slats of the palettes and then pressed the Spanish moss on top of the glue. And I continued that step over and over again until I had the Spanish moss in between all of the wood slats. And to help me out a little bit and get the Spanish moss like pushed in between the slats, I used the end of an old paintbrush, and that really seemed to help me out a lot. After I've added all of my Spanish moss, I then took some scissors and trimmed all of it up so that it was a little bit more manicured and not so messy looking. Next, I'm adding some of these mini succulents that I picked up from Amazon. I'm pressing the stems of them right in between the Spanish moss that I applied, and I just keep moving them around until I get them exactly where I want them. And I will say these were really great quality succulents, but I had opened them up out of their package and just had them pretty much thrown in my craft stash, so it did take some of the coating off of them. So if you're going to be using these, don't open them until you're ready to use them. Now that I have my succulents all placed where I want them, I'm flipping my palette over, and then to hold all of the succulents in place, I'm placing hot glue around the stems and just holding them into place until the glue dries. I was gonna attach them with either some string or bend over the metal part along the backside on the stem of the succulent, but the metal is really thick and I wasn't able to bend it, so I ended up just using the hot glue. For the last step, I'm making my hanger for my palette. I'm taking 2 pieces of jute and I'm tying a knot on one end. I'm measuring how long I want my hanger to be. I'm tying a knot on the other end and then just cutting off that excess jute. And then to attach the hanger, I'm placing hot glue along the back side of the palette and pressing the jute strands that I just made a knot on right onto the glue to fully attach them to make my hanger. And here is my mini succulent garden all finished. I love how this turned out, and these little mini succulents are such good quality. They would be great for any spring or summer project. And now moving on to DIY number 2, I'm making a spring wreath. For this project, I used a 10-inch embroidery hoop, a mini wooden birdhouse, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art chalk paint in castle, paintbrushes, Spanish moss from Dollar Tree and also reindeer moss from Dollar Tree, floral foam, eucalyptus stems from Walmart, spring stems from Dollar Tree, jute, scissors, and my hot glue gun. For this project, I started by painting my house with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. I used this color on the front, the sides, and the back of this house, and I only had to do one coat of paint for this. And for the top of the house, I painted it with my folk art chalk paint in the color castle, and I only had to do one coat of this as well. And then for the bottom base of my house, I used that same castle color. I then painted my embroidery hoop with Waverly chalk paint in the color crystal, and then I decided that I really didn't like that color and I wanted this embroidery hoop to match the birdhouse. So once that crystal color dried, I just painted over it with that Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster so that it would match my birdhouse. I wasn't really a fan of the hanger that was in the birdhouse originally, so I took that out, and to replace it, I used 2 strands of jute and I tied them together. I did 2 large knots so that when I place this into the birdhouse, it'll stay in and not come out. I then took the other end of those pieces of jute and strung it through the top hole in the birdhouse. It was a little bit tricky and took me a few attempts to finally get it through, but after a little while, I finally got it. I then took those strands of jute and I wanted to see about where I wanted the birdhouse to hang on my embroidery hoop, so I was just working with it a little bit to see exactly where I needed to tie it. I then untied the house and took it off of the embroidery hoop because I decided I wanted to add some moss to the roof of the house. So I'm taking some hot glue, putting it right on the roof of the house, and then pressing some of this reindeer moss from Dollar Tree right over top. I did that to both sides of the roof. And then once I had it all on, I obviously needed to trim it because it was really long and out of control. So I took some scissors and trimmed it up a bit. And then I also wanted to add a little bit of Spanish moss. So here I'm doing the same thing. I'm placing hot glue right on top of the roof of the house and then pressing some of that Spanish moss over top. I also added the reindeer moss and Spanish moss to the stem of the house and then also the base, the same as I did the moss on the roof. I'm now taking my embroidery hoop and the side with the screw on it, I'm centering it into my floral foam and then just pressing it right into that foam. And I forgot to mention earlier, I am only using the outer ring of this embroidery hoop. This is just a leftover one I had in my craft stash. I'm then taking some of this eucalyptus right off their stems, and I picked the eucalyptus up from Walmart. And I'm pressing the stems of the eucalyptus right into the floral foam. And originally I was just gonna have the eucalyptus stick out, but then decided I wanted to have them like wrapped around the floral foam. So then I'm taking the other end of that eucalyptus and pressing that into the floral foam as well. And I added more of the eucalyptus stems all the way around the front of this piece of floral foam. Next, I'm adding some more flowers and greenery from the stems that I picked up from Dollar Tree. I'm using the end of a paintbrush to make a hole in my floral foam and then placing hot glue in that hole and then just pressing the stems right in there. And I did take the stems off and cut them down a little bit so that they were easier to place in my hole. And I'm continuing that same step until I have the front of the floral foam completely covered in flowers and greenery. Next, I'm adding some Spanish moss to this floral arrangement. To attach it, I'm placing hot glue right onto the floral foam and then pressing the Spanish moss over top of it. And I did this for in between all of the greenery and then on all of the other parts of the floral foam that were showing on the sides and then also on the back side. For the last step in this project, I'm wrapping my hanger for my birdhouse around the very top of my embroidery hoop. I'm getting it all into place and centered before I add some hot glue on that jute, and then I'm just holding it into place until the glue has completely dried. Here is my spring embroidery hoop wreath all finished. This project just screams spring to me, and I did end up hanging it from the center of an old picture frame. And now for the last DIY today, I'll be making a lavender floral arrangement. For this project, I used a small glass votive, black sand from Dollar Tree, white stones also from Dollar Tree, lavender stems from Hobby Lobby, jute, and some scissors. For this one, I started out by pouring this black sand that I picked up from Dollar Tree right into this glass jar or votive until it was about 3/4 of the way full. I then added some of these white rocks that I also picked up from Dollar Tree right over top of that black sand until my jar was completely full. After I had my jar full, I then took some of these cutters and cut these lavenders right off of their stems, and I did pick this set of lavender up at Hobby Lobby. Next, I took each little stem of lavender and placed it right in between the rocks going down into the sand to hold all of them into place. And I continued that until I had lavender going around the entire jar, and I think I used 5 of them. Once I had the lavender in, I then took a piece of jute and I wrapped it around the very top of the jar and just made a small knot and cut off the excess jute. Here is my lavender floral arrangement all complete. This one was so simple to make, it couldn't get any easier. For the first DIY, I'll be making a spring moss frame, and for this project, I used an unfinished 4x6 frame from Hobby Lobby, wood stems from Dollar Tree, 13 large popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree, wood letters from Hobby Lobby, reindeer moss from Dollar Tree, Waverly chalk paint and plaster, folk art chalk paint and Java, paintbrushes, scissors, and my hot glue gun. For this project, I started out by painting 9 of my large popsicle sticks with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, and I only had to do 1 coat of this paint. Once that was all dry, then I went in with my Java colored paint and I dry brushed that around all of the edges of the popsicle sticks and a little bit on the top surface to give them a distressed look. Next, I'm painting my wood letters with my chalk paint in the color ink, and I'm using the letters that spell out the word spring, and I only had to do 1 coat of this paint. Now I'm putting together the background for my frame. I'm laying out 4 more popsicle sticks that I didn't bother painting because you won't see them, and I'm hot gluing 9 painted sticks onto the 4 non-painted ones. This is going to make a nice wooden background for my frame. Next, I'm laying out my wood stems from Dollar Tree onto my wood frame. I'm moving them around a lot to get them exactly in the places that I'm going to be wanting to attach them. Once I have them all set into place, then I'm just simply picking them up, placing hot glue on the back side, and then pressing them down onto the wood frame. And I continued this step over and over again until I had all of the wood stems glued down to my frame in the exact places that I want them. I now have all of my wood stems attached to my frame. Now I'm going to be adding some moss, and to do that I'm placing hot glue right onto the wood frame in between all of the wood stems and then placing the moss right on the hot glue to attach it. I continued this step over and over again until I had my whole frame covered with moss, and I did make sure that I covered the sides of the frame with moss as well. And to help me out just a little bit in between all of the small areas between the wood stems, I used the end of a paintbrush to just press the moss in between those areas. Now I'm attaching my wood background to my frame. I'm placing hot glue right on the back side of my frame and then placing that background that I made with popsicle sticks onto the hot glue to attach it. Once that's all attached, I'm then laying out my letters that spell out spring to get them in place before I start gluing them down. To glue the letters on, I'm placing a little bit of hot glue on the back of each letter and then pressing them down onto the wood surface. And I continued that for each letter. And yes, I do realize that my G is upside down. I actually glued it down like this and I had to peel it off. So make sure that you don't do that if you decide to do this project. Here is my spring moss frame all finished. This was such an easy and inexpensive project, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. And now for DIY number 2, potted moss balls. For this project, I used 2 3.5-inch terracotta pots from Dollar Tree, 2 3-inch foam balls from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in plaster and also in the color hazelnut, folk art chalk paint in castle, paintbrushes, reindeer moss from Dollar Tree, scissors, jute, and also my hot glue gun. For For this project, I started by painting both of my terracotta pots with that Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I only had to do one coat of this paint. And once that was all dry, I then went in with my castle colored paint and I just started dabbing that all over the white paint with a chip brush. And I did this over and over again until it was pretty covered in that castle colored paint. And once that was dry, I then went in with my hazelnut colored paint on a Dollar Tree stencil brush and I dabbed that over top of the castle color. This is going to give a lot of dimension and texture to my terracotta pots. I want them to look aged and distressed, and this is really going to add a lot of that texture that I need. And now I'm adding that plaster color back onto my pot using a chip brush, and I'm dabbing it all over my pot on top of the other colors that I just painted on. And this is going to add more of that texture that I want for the age effect that I'm trying to get, and I really love the way that it turned out. Now I'm going to be making my moss balls. I'm just tearing up the reindeer moss a little bit before I start attaching it. And to attach it to my ball, I'm placing hot glue right onto the foam ball and then placing the reindeer moss on top of the glue to attach it. And then I needed it cut up a little bit more, so I'm just cutting it up with some scissors, and that really helped out. Then I'm just continuing to put glue onto the ball and then placing the reindeer moss on the glue, and I'm just continuing this step over and over again until my whole ball is covered in the moss. The moss looked a little messy, so here I'm just going in with some scissors and trimming up all of that reindeer moss so that I have a little bit more of a circular shape to both of the balls. You could leave the balls just like this, but I wanted to add some jute around both of the balls. So here I'm just wrapping the jute around the ball and tying it using a little bit of hot glue to hold that jute into place, and then wrapping the two pieces of jute around the ball in just random spots. And I'm continuing to wrap it around until I think that there's enough jute added, and then just tying it off, hot gluing that end piece down, and then cutting off the extra. For the last step, I'm taking a doubled piece of jute, tying it around the top lip of the terracotta pot, and then just using some hot glue to hold that jute into place, and then cutting off the extra long jute ends. Here are my finished potted moss balls. These again were so easy to make and are the perfect inexpensive project to add a touch of spring to your home. And now moving on to the third and final DIY for today, a farmhouse window frame. For this project, I used 4 8x10 canvases from Dollar Tree, wood letters from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in Plaster, folk art chalk paint in Castle and also in the color Sage, paintbrushes, my hot glue gun, a utility knife, jute, scissors, burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, a nail and hammer, some eucalyptus from Walmart, and also a willow wreath from Dollar Tree. This one I started by cutting all 4 of the canvases from their wood frames using a utility knife. I did use a really sharp utility knife. It helps you get the canvas off a lot easier. I've done it with dull knives in the past, and it's actually more dangerous this way, so if you are using a utility knife to get the canvas off, just make sure that you're very careful. Once I got it all off, I am saving the canvases for another project, but I will not be using them for this one. And I did peel off the extra canvas that was attached by some of those staples. Once all of that was off, then I went in with my folk art chalk paint in the color Sage, and I painted that around all 4 of my wood frames on the inside and all of the edges as well. Once that sage color was completely dry, I then went in with my plaster color, and I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush to dry brush this color over top of the sage. And I did use a pretty good amount of paint because I did want this to look really rustic and distressed. I'm then painting all of my wood letters with my chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I am using the words that spell out the word Farmhouse, and I only had to do 1 coat of this paint. Next, I'm attaching all of the wood frames together. I'm just placing them down how I'm going to want them to be, and then I'm taking the hot glue and just putting it right on the edge of the frame. Once I have the glue all on, then I'm just pressing 2 of the frames together, and then I'm holding them in place until the glue is completely dried. I'm continuing to put the glue around the edges of the wood frames and then pressing them together until I have all 4 of them attached exactly how I want them to be. Next, I'm measuring out this burlap ribbon around the very top of my wood frame and then just cutting that ribbon down to size. I'm then wrapping the ribbon edges around the back side of the frame, and then to attach it, I'm just using some hot glue right on the back side of the frame and then pressing the ribbon on the glue. I did end up using the end of a paintbrush to press the ribbon onto the glue because I did not want to burn my fingers, and as you guys know, I tend to do that quite often. Now I'm laying out all of my letters that spell Farmhouse onto the very front of my burlap ribbon. Once I have them all set into place, then I'm gluing them down. I'm placing hot glue right on the back side of the letter and then just pressing them down onto the burlap ribbon. And I continued to do that until I had all of my letters that spell Farmhouse all glued down. Next, I'm cutting some of these eucalyptus stems from their bundle that I picked up from Walmart. You guys, these are such good quality and they are only $2 per bundle. So if you go to Walmart, I definitely suggest picking some of these stems up. Then I'm just placing the stems inside of one of these willow wreaths that I picked up from Dollar Tree. This is a 9-inch willow wreath, and I'm only putting the eucalyptus at the very bottom of this wreath. Once I have that all in place, then I'm taking a doubled piece of jute and making a really simple bow. To attach the jute bow, I'm just placing it right in the center of the eucalyptus stems at the bottom of my wreath and taking another piece of jute and just tying that around my bow. And for the last step, I'm taking a nail and hammering it right in the place where I want to hang my wreath, and then I'm just simply placing the wreath right on top of the nail. Here is my finished farmhouse window frame. Again, this one was so easy to create and can actually be used for multiple seasons by just switching out the wreath. For DIY number 1, I'll be making a hanging flower box, and for this project, I'll be using 4 7-inch by 3.5-inch pieces of wood that came in this bag of wood from Hobby Lobby, a 2.5-inch terracotta pot from Dollar Tree, spring stems from Michaels, Waverly chalk paint in plaster and also in the color hazelnut, folk art chalk paint in Castle, paintbrushes, a hammer. I'll be using 8 nails, a drill, my hot glue gun, floral foam from Dollar Tree, and some jute. For this project, I started out by painting all 4 of my 7-inch by 3.5-inch pieces of wood with my chalk paint in the color Castle, and I did paint all of the sides of my pieces of wood since you're going to be able to see them for this project, but I did only have to do 1 coat of this paint. Once that paint has completely dried, I'm then going in with my Waverly chalk paint in the color hazelnut, and I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush to dry brush this color right over top of that Castle color, and I did that on all 4 pieces of wood. And then I added a little bit of my Java colored chalk paint around mainly the edges of my pieces of wood, but I did do a little bit on the flat surface as well. And I'm just dry brushing that on using my Dollar Tree stencil brush. This is just really going to add a more rustic look to all of my pieces of wood. Next, I'm painting my terracotta pot with my chalk paint in the color plaster, and I only did 1 coat of this paint, but I did take the tag off of the bottom and paint the bottom. Since it's going to be lifted, you'll be able to see the bottom of this pot, and then I did a little bit on the inside as well. Once that paint dried, then I went in with the Java colored paint and just dry brushed that right over top, again to give this pot a rustic look. Next, I'm assembling my box and attaching all of my wood. I'm placing hot glue in the corner of my bottom wood piece and then placing another piece of wood standing vertical on top of that glue and then just holding it into place until the glue has completely dried. I'm continuing that same step for the other side, and once I have those 2 attached, then I can attach my very top piece of wood. I'm placing hot glue on the 2 ends of the standing pieces of wood and then placing my last piece of wood right on top of the glue to form my box. To make sure everything stays nice and secure and put together, I'm adding 2 nails on each side of my box. I basically just used the hot glue to hold everything together until I could nail it together. You could use E6000 or wood glue if you wanted, but I would definitely suggest nailing everything together as well, just to make sure that everything stays in place and put together. I'm now measuring to see where the center of the top of my box is. I am going to be drilling a hole, so I wanted to make sure that I had everything centered before I start drilling. Next, I'm drilling a hole right in the center of my box to get it prepped for adding the jute through it later. And now back to my pot. I'm attaching some jute. I'm using hot glue right on the pot and then putting the jute over that to hold all of the jute in place. And I'm continuing that same step over and over again until I have my jute wrapped around the pot, probably like 7 or 8 times. I needed this to be really secure because I am going to be hanging the pot from the jute. Now I want 2 pieces of jute, which is the one strand that I'm using now. I want the 2 ends of that jute to be going in one direction, like on the right side. And now I'm using another piece of jute that I'm attaching, and I'm wrapping that around several times, and then I'm having those 2 end strands facing the opposite direction, so those would be on the left hand side. Now I'm using the 2 strands on each side to hold up my pot going through the hole that I put into my box. As you can see here, I'm stringing the ends of my jute right through that drilled hole in the top of my box. Once I have my jute through, then I'm just seeing how long I want my pot to be hanging, and once I have that all set into place, I'm tying off a knot at the top of my jute, and I did do a double knot just to make sure that everything stayed in place. Next, I'm cutting some of these eucalyptus stems that I picked up from Walmart. Originally, I was just going to use one type of flower, but I ended up going with these as well. And then I'm cutting down some of this floral foam to fit inside of my pot, and I'm just placing that foam right in the center. And for the last step, I'm placing some of those eucalyptus stems that I cut down right into the floral foam. And I decided to use a second flower. I'm using some of these spring florals that I picked up from Michael's as well. I'm just cutting those stems down a little bit with some pliers, and then I'm placing the stems of those right into the floral foam like I did with the eucalyptus. And I really love the way that these 2 flowers look together. Here's my hanging flower box all finished. I love how this one turned out. And what's great about this one is you can switch out the florals that are in the pot to go with whatever season it is. Now moving on to the second DIY, I'll be making a flower market sign. For this one, I used a Valentine's Day sign from Dollar Tree, Waverly chalk paint in the colors plaster and also in moss, folk art chalk paint in Java, paintbrushes, my hot glue gun, jute, burlap ribbon from Walmart, and a fresh flower market image that I created on my computer and printed onto wax paper. I'll have the printable to this linked down below. For this project, I'm using the back of this Dollar Tree Valentine's Day sign, and I started by painting the back of the sign with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. And I did do 2 coats of this paint just to make sure that everything was nice and covered. Once this paint has completely dried, I'm then going in with my Java colored paint, and I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush to dry brush this color around all of the edges of the sign. And I did a little bit on the center as well, but mainly focused that color on the edges. And then once I had that color on, I went in with my moss colored chalk paint and dry brushed that around all of the edges. But I used this color mainly on the center. I really wanted this to have a little bit of a green hint to it, and I really love the way that it turned out. Next, I'm centering my fresh flower market image onto my sign. Then I'm taking an old gift card and I'm pressing the ink for all of my words into the surface of my sign. You want to make sure that you're holding the wax paper really tight because you don't want it to move around. It'll smudge your ink. Then I'm taking the end of a paintbrush and I'm going over each letter for my words, kind of like if you were writing over the words. This is going to press the ink into the surface of the sign even more. If you guys would like the printable for this sign, I will have it linked down in the description box. And if you're wanting to see a more in-depth tutorial on wax paper transfers, I will have my video linked down in the description box on that as well. After I have all of the ink pressed really well into the surface of my sign, I'm very slowly peeling off the wax paper. I left some large spaces between the words seeds, stems, and blooms. So here I'm taking a small paintbrush and painting dots in between those words with my ink colored chalk paint. Next, I'm forming my bow to go on my sign. I'm cutting out a large piece of this burlap ribbon. It was about 35 inches in length. I'm then forming 2 loops, one on the right side, one on the left. I'm then cinching the loops in towards the bottom. And then I'm taking one of the loops, putting it over top of the other loop, and then pulling that through the little hole at the bottom, kind of like you would be tying your shoe. Once I have the bow all made, I'm just fluffing up each side of the loop to form my bow. And for the tails of my bow, I'm just cutting them both in a diagonal shape. And now I'm attaching my bow to my sign. I'm placing hot glue on the back of the bow and then just pressing the bow on the top of my sign. And I really wanted to add some flowers, so here I'm cutting these spring florals off of their stems, and I picked these ones up from Michael's, and then I'm just hot gluing them around and underneath the top portion of my bow. For the last step, I'm taking 5 strands of jute and I'm placing them on the bottom of my sign where I want them. Then I'm flipping the sign over and then just hot gluing those ends of the jute along the back side to hold everything into place. Here is my fresh flower market sign all finished. This project was so inexpensive to do and I just love how everything came together. For the first DIY today, I'm making a Hello Spring sign. For this project, I'm using one of these unfinished wood picket fences from Dollar Tree, and I'm painting this entire piece with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I only did 1 coat of this paint, and I did make sure to paint in between all of the wood pieces as well. I'm also using this Hello Spring unfinished wood piece that I picked up from Joann Fabrics. I think I paid either $1.99 or $1.49 for it, and I got it for 40% off of that. I'm painting the Hello word with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Summer Porch. And then for the word Spring, I'm painting that with the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Sage Shadow. Next, I'm cutting a strip of this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree. I'm cutting it long enough so that I have the 2 ends long enough that I can wrap around the front of my fence. And then I'm also cutting that ribbon in half to make it just a little bit thinner. And then I pulled the little burlap strips around the edges so that they looked a little bit more frayed. And then I took that burlap ribbon and then just hot glued the 2 ends of the ribbon along the back side of my fence. Now it's time to attach my Hello Spring wood piece. I'm placing hot glue on the back side of both of those words, and then I'm placing that in the top left-hand corner of my fence a little bit crooked. Then I'm adding some of these really pretty yellow flowers that I got from Walmart a few years ago, but you can get these types of flowers at any craft store. And I'm hot gluing those right over top of that burlap ribbon. I'm placing hot glue right on the stem of my flower and then just pressing that onto the burlap ribbon. And some of them I did place over top of each other. And I did have to hold the flowers in place until the glue completely set, just so that they wouldn't move around at all. I continued this same step over and over until I had my yellow flowers completely covering the bottom of that burlap ribbon and my fence. And then once I had all of the yellow flowers attached, I decided to add some of these white flowers that I got from Hobby Lobby. I just pulled them off of their stem, and then I did end up cutting the stems a little bit just to make them smaller to place over top of my yellow flowers. And to attach these flowers, I did the same thing as I did with the yellow flowers. I placed the hot glue right on the stem of the flower and then just pressed that down on my burlap and over top of the yellow flowers. Then I decided to add some Spanish moss at the very bottom of the stems of all those flowers, and I used hot glue to attach that. Once I had the Spanish moss on, I thought it would be really cute to add some more green at the bottom, so I used some reindeer moss from Dollar Tree and just hot glued that over top of the Spanish moss. For one last finishing touch to my sign, I decided to add a raffia bow. I used 3 strips of raffia and then tied those into a really simple bow and then hot glued that on the right top hand corner of my fence. And here's my Hello Spring fence sign all finished. This one was super easy to do and would be the perfect piece to add to the center of a wreath or maybe another larger project, or leave it just as is. Now moving into DIY number 2, I'm making a welcome spring sign. For this one, I'm using one of these larger signs from Dollar Tree. This one is from Valentine's Day. I just hadn't done anything with it yet. It has glitter on it, which I'm not a fan of, so I will be removing that, but I really loved that this sign had a frame around it. To remove the glitter, I took one of my putty knives and just started scraping that glitter off. This usually works great, but I did find that once I had the glitter removed with my putty knife, there was still like a little bit of a raised-ness, I guess you could say, to the lettering. So I took some sandpaper and just sanded that down as smooth as I possibly could. The only thing is I used a 60 grit sandpaper, so it did leave the back texture part a little bit rough, but I was okay with that. Just keep in mind that a 60 grit is probably not the best sandpaper to use for this. Once I had that all sanded down, I then went in and started painting my entire frame. I did use my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I really loved that when I was painting this on, it was leaving a little bit of that wood grain underneath, and I think that gave it a really nice, kind of like a stained wood look, and I really liked how that turned out. Then I moved on and started painting the back surface of my sign, and I painted that with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did paint 2 coats of this paint on the back. After my paint was completely dry, I'm then using one of these wreath stencils from Hobby Lobby. This one was $3.49, but they always have really good sales on them. I did have to cut it down just a little bit on the side to get it to fit inside of my frame. Once I had it placed exactly where I wanted it to be, I then used some painter's tape at the top and bottom to hold the stencil into place. The paint color that I'm using to stencil the wreath is from Folk Art, and it is called Sage Shadow. I really love this color. It's the perfect green color for spring. And to apply this paint color, I am using my Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I'm just building up that color a little bit at a time so that I don't have any bleeding. Once I had it all painted on and my paint was dry, I then removed my stencil. I'll be using a few other pieces in today's project, and one of them is this unfinished welcome word. This one did come from Hobby Lobby in a pack with a bunch of other different words, and I'll also be using some unfinished wood letters that spell out the word spring. These ones I think are from Meyer, but you can get unfinished wood letters at pretty much any craft store. I'll be painting the word welcome and all of my letters with my Waverly chalk paint in the color ink, and I only did 1 coat of paint on all of them. Now it's time to attach my word and all of my letters to the center of my sign. I like to place them exactly where I want them to be before I start gluing them, because you don't know how many times I've started gluing stuff down and then it wasn't centered. So I always like to just set it down into place first before I start attaching them. I place hot glue on the back side of my welcome word and then place that exactly where I'd already had it placed, and then the same for all of my letters that spell out the word spring. And here is my welcome spring sign all finished. This one is such a simple piece, but I think it looks so high end. It only took me a few minutes to create, and it's just a really beautiful piece that goes with any decor. Now moving into DIY 3, I'm making a welcome birdhouse stand. For this one, I'm using one of these unfinished wood birdhouses, and this one is from Michael's, and it was 99 cents. I first started by painting the birdhouse with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I only did 1 coat of this paint, but for the little inside crevices that you see on the front, I did have to use a really small paintbrush just to get that paint in there and not get it all over the rest of the birdhouse. For this project, I'm not going to need the hanger that's on this birdhouse, so I just clipped it off the top and then removed those strings. Once I had the strings removed, I then continued painting my birdhouse. I painted the roof with my Waverly chalk paint in the color ink, and then I did like the sides of the roof and then the bottom of the birdhouse, and then all of that trim that's on the front of the birdhouse, I painted that with the ink color too. And I did start using a thicker brush and it just wasn't working out, so I had to switch to a really small paintbrush so that I could have nice precise lines and not have it look all messy. I'm also painting the very bottom of my birdhouse with that same ink colored chalk paint because you will be seeing the bottom of the birdhouse. And then I wanted my house to have a more of a rustic look to it, so I took my full color chalk paint in the color Castle on a fluffy paintbrush, and I just dry brushed this color on my entire birdhouse. I'm also using one of these paint stirrers. These do come in a pack from Home Depot, and I think you get like a whole big pack for like under $2. I already have mine pre-cut. This one is 6 inches long, and I'm painting the entire paint stirrer with my Waverly paint in the color ink, and I did, like I said, the entire piece, the front, the back, and the sides. Once that paint was dry, I then took that Castle colored chalk paint that I used on my birdhouse, and I dry brushed that over top of this piece to keep it consistent and the same color as my birdhouse. Now I'm painting this small wooden box that I got from Dollar Tree with that same chalk paint in the color ink. I did 1 coat of paint on the entire box. Once the box was dry, I then took that Castle color paint and dry brushed that over top of all of the ink colored paint. Just like before, I wanted to keep things consistent and have everything match, so I wanted to paint everything the same. But for this piece, I got from Michael's. This is just like a little wooden piece. It does have a hanger on it, but I will be clipping that off. I painted this piece with my Waverly paint in the color Plaster. I did 1 coat of this paint on the entire piece, and then I used that same Castle color to distress it and just dry brush this over top of it. Next, I'm using these Welcome wood stickers. These are from the Target Dollar Spot a couple of years ago. I had them in my craft stash and I just really need to use them up. So I'm taking that same ink colored chalk paint once again, and I'm painting all of these letters that spell out the word welcome with this paint. Once the paint was dry, I then am just taking the wood letters off and placing them onto my white plank that I've already painted. And since they are like stickers, I don't have to hot glue them down. I just placed them kind of where I wanted them to be before I like really pushed them down onto my wood. Then I moved them around, and once I had them all in place, I pushed them down, and they seem to stick pretty well without using any glue. I did clip the hanger off of that, and then now I'm just attaching my paint stirrer to the bottom of my birdhouse, and then I'm using some of this floral foam from Dollar Tree. I just cut it down a little bit so it'll fit into my wood box, place it inside, and then I'm using some of this reindeer moss from Dollar Tree, placing that into my box over top of my floral foam, and then sticking my paint stirrer right down into that floral foam to hold everything into place. To add a little bit more detail to my birdhouse, I decided to add some Spanish moss to the roof. I just hot glued that right on, and then I did have to trim it down a little bit because Spanish moss can be pretty messy. After I had the Spanish moss on, I decided I wanted to add some reindeer moss as well, so I just hot glued the reindeer moss right over top of the Spanish moss, and I continued that same step and process for the entire roof of my birdhouse. Then for the last step, I'm hot gluing my welcome plank right in the center of that paint stirrer underneath my birdhouse. This is my birdhouse stand all finished. This is such a cute piece. Again, super simple, but yet it looks way more expensive than it took for me to make this. For the first DIY today, I'm making a plant grow in bloom picture. For the challenge, I have been challenged with a picture frame. So this is the frame that I'm going to be using in today's video or today's project. And it was 99 cents from the thrift store. I love getting frames from the thrift store because you can get really good quality frames for a really inexpensive price. I first started by painting my entire frame with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I did do 2 coats of this paint on my entire frame. I made sure to do the back as well, just to make sure that this looks like a finished project. Once that was all dry, I then took some sandpaper and started sanding around my frame around all of the raised parts, just to give this frame a really distressed rustic look, which you guys know is the style that I love most. I'm also using one of these moss sheets that I picked up from Dollar Tree. I'm using the inside of the frame as a guide to help me cut out the moss sheet to the exact size that I need. I just place that backing of the frame onto the moss and then cut around it. Now that I have my moss sheet all cut down to size, I'm then using some hot glue to attach it to the backing that was inside of the frame. I'm then placing that backing with the moss back inside of my frame and securing it. I'm also going to be using some of these Scrabble letter blocks that spell out the words plant, grow, and also the word bloom. I picked up these Scrabble blocks from Dollar General, and I believe they were $3 for an entire pack. I'm placing them onto my moss in my frame how I want them to be before I start gluing them down. I always do this step with all of my projects. I place everything down first where I want it to be before I start gluing, because there's been so many times where I just start gluing right away and then things are not where they should be. I thought it would be really cute to add 3 of these wood flowers underneath my words. I picked these ones up from Hobby Lobby. They came in this pack of unfinished wood icons. These are spring related. They came from the spring shop at Hobby Lobby and they were $4.99, but I paid 40% off of that price. For all of the flower parts of my wood flowers, I'm painting them with my folk art chalk paint in the color Victorian Pink. Then for the stems of the flowers, I'm painting all 3 of them with the folk art chalk paint in the color Sage Shadow. For the last step in this project, I'm just using some hot glue on the back of all of the letters that I've already placed where I want them to be, and then the same with the flowers. I just place hot glue on the back side and then just put them back down into place. And here's the plant, grow, and bloom picture all finished. This was such an easy and inexpensive project that only took me a few minutes to create, and it's the perfect piece to add just a touch of spring to my home. Now moving right on into DIY number 2 on making a succulent garden. For this project, I'm also using a picture frame. This one is from Dollar Tree and it's a 3.5 by 5 inch frame. I'm first starting out by taking the entire frame apart. Then I'm painting the frame with my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I did 2 coats of this paint. In today's project, I'm also using 4 of these unfinished wooden caps that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. I'm painting them with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I only did a 1 coat of paint. Next, I'm taking that cardboard backing that's on the frame and then I'm just ripping off the stand that's on that because I won't need it for this project. And then I'm placing that backing back into my picture frame and securing it. I'm now adding the 4 caps that I've already painted onto the bottom of my frame. These are going to be the little feet on my succulent garden, and I just placed hot glue on the bottom of each cap and then just press that down onto the bottom of the frame. For the succulents that I'm using in today's project, most of them are from Dollar Tree. A few of them I have are just from my craft stash that I've purchased a while ago. To start creating my succulent garden, I'm adding some Spanish moss to the backing of my frame. I just placed hot glue right onto the backing and then pressed the Spanish moss on top of that. Once I had all of the Spanish moss added, I then went in with the succulents. Some of the succulents from Dollar Tree do have a little clip on the back. I just pulled that off, which was really easy to do, and then I placed hot glue on the back side of the succulent and then just pressed that down into the Spanish moss. I then continued that same step until I had all of my succulents that I'm going to be using added to my succulent garden. Then to add some more details, I decided to add some of these white mini rocks that I picked up from Dollar Tree around all of my succulents. To attach them, I placed hot glue on the back side of each rock and then placed them down around all of my succulents. I continued that same step until I had white rocks going around all of my succulents. Then to add even more detail, I decided to add some reindeer moss, also from Dollar Tree, around and on top of all of my white rocks. I put the hot glue pretty much right on top of the rocks and then pressed the reindeer moss on top of that. And now for DIY number 3, I'm making a spring picture. The end of a paintbrush to do this because I felt like it got the moss in between the rocks really well this way. This is my raised succulent garden all finished. I think it turned out super cute, and I really haven't seen anything like this in store, so I'm so happy I was able to create it all on my own. For this one, again, of course, I'm using a picture frame. This is an unfinished wood picture frame that I picked up from Michael's. It did come in a pack of either 2 or 3 of these frames, and I'm starting by painting the frame with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I only did 1 coat of this paint. Once that paint was all dry, I then took my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I very lightly dry brushed this color over top of the plaster color to give it a distressed rustic look. As you guys know, that's my favorite style. Once that was all finished, I then moved on and started painting a 3-inch embroidery hoop. I used that same plaster colored paint and only did 1 coat of this paint on my hoop. I'm also using one of these unfinished wood circles. This one was just from my craft stash, but I know that you can get these at pretty much any craft store, and I'm painting this with that same plastered colored chalk paint. I wanted my circle to fit inside of my embroidery hoop, but it wasn't exactly a tight fit and I needed them to stay together. So to get them to stick together, I decided to add some Spanish moss around the entire inside of my embroidery hoop, right where the circle meets. To attach the Spanish moss, I just placed hot glue on the inside and then pressed the moss on top of the glue. I then gave my moss a little bit of a trim so that it looked more put together and not so messy. In this project, I decided to add some of these small wood beads with letters. I am spelling out the word spring, and I'm just stringing those onto a piece of jute. I strung the first letter, which was S, onto my jute and then tied a double knot to hold that bead into place. And then I finished stringing the beads on to spell out the word spring. And then after I had all of the letters on, I wanted to make sure that they stayed secure and didn't move around, so then I did another knot on the end of the jute right next to the letter G. Then I needed to attach the wood beads to the top of my embroidery hoop, so I just placed it where I wanted it to be, wrapped the jute pieces along the back side of my hoop, cut those down, and then hot glued the 2 ends of the jute down into place. Then I decided I wanted to add a little bit of this reindeer moss to the very bottom of my embroidery hoop right over top of that Spanish moss, so I just added some using some hot glue to attach it. And I'm also going to be using 2 of these unfinished wood birds. These did come from that same pack from Hobby Lobby of the little unfinished wood icons that I showed you earlier in the video. And for both birds, I'm painting them with my folk art chalk paint in the color Summer Porch. After the paint was all dry on both of my birds, I'm then using some hot glue on the back side of both of them to attach them to the inside of my hoop right underneath my word spring, and I did it so that both birds were touching with their beaks. Next, I'm taking a piece of jute and I'm tying it in a knot around the top screw of my embroidery hoop. This is going to help me be able to attach my hoop to my picture frame. I'm then taking those 2 strands of jute and I'm going to be attaching them to the back side of the top of my frame. I just cut those jute pieces down and then use some hot glue to attach them. I thought it would be super cute to add a bright ribbon to this project, so I made a simple bow out of this really bright blue colored checked ribbon, and I'm then just cutting those ends of the ribbon down a little bit in a diagonal and then hot glued that bow to the very top of my embroidery hoop. I originally was going to leave the back of this frame open, but then I decided that I wanted it enclosed, so I'm using 2 of these rectangle wood planks. These are from Dollar Tree. They come in a pack of, I believe, 4, and I'm just using 2 of them for this project today, and I decided I wanted to have them stained, so I'm staining them with my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown from Michael's, and I'm using an old rag to apply the stain. And once I have them all stained, then I'm ready to attach them to the back of the frame so that it's enclosed and not open. To attach the 2 planks, I used hot glue on the back side of my frame. And this is the spring picture all finished. Again, a simple and affordable project for spring. Now for the fourth and final DIY today, I'm making a bloom where you are planted sign or a picture. For this one, no surprise, I'm using a picture frame. This one is from Goodwill and I paid $2.99 for it. Again, I love getting thrifted frames. This one has like the little bead detail on the front, which I love. I first started by just using some scissors to help me get the backing off of this frame. And then I also took out the glass portion of the frame as well. For the frame color, I'm painting it with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I did do 2 different coats of this paint, and because it has like that raised bead look on the front of this frame, I thought it would be really cute to add some distressing. I used my Dollar Tree stencil brush with the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle and just dry brush that color over top of the entire frame. For the frame, I'm not going to be using the original backing that came on the frame. I want this to have a wood background, so I'm using these popsicle sticks to look like wood slats. So I just measured them out to see how many I needed, and then I started cutting the 2 like rounded ends off of each side so that those popsicle sticks lay really flat inside of my frame. And I continued to do that until I had all of my popsicle sticks cut on each end, and I just used the first one as a guide to help me cut the rest of them off. Now that I have all of my popsicle sticks cut, I'm now staining all of them with my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown, and I'm using an old rag to apply the stain. I'm only staining the front side. I don't need to stain the back side because you will not be seeing this. To attach the popsicle sticks to my frame, I'm using hot glue, and I just put the hot glue on the inside of the frame and then pressed the popsicle stick on top of that. And I continued the same step over and over until I had all of my popsicle sticks attached on the inside of my frame. Then for the design that I'm going to be using on my wood, I'm using this Bloom Where You Are Planted stencil that I got in a pack of stencils from Amazon. I'm only going to be using the words on the stencil. I don't have room to use the wreath around it, but I wanted to hold it into place while I'm painting, so I just cut those ends off so that I'm able to tape the stencil onto my frame to keep it from moving around. And this was going to be a little bit more tricky since the stencil is raised up a little bit from the frame, so I just have to be really careful when I'm stenciling my paint color on to just hold the stencil down into place without moving it so I don't have any bleeding underneath each letter. For my word bloom, I used Folk Art chalk paint in the color Cascade. Then the words Where You Are, I used the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. Then for the bottom word Planted, I used the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Vintage Victorian. After the paint was all dry, I then peeled off my stencil. To add some detail to this picture, I'm using, again, one of those little unfinished wood icons from Hobby Lobby, and I'm using this butterfly. I originally started to paint it with that Vintage Victorian color and then decided I wanted it to be a green color, so I'm using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Sage Shadow for that. Then I'm also using this little watering can from that same icon pack, and for this one I'm painting it in the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Summer Porch. Then for the last step in this project, I'm using hot glue to attach both of those icons at the very top of my picture in a diagonal. This is my Bloom Where You Are Planted picture all finished. It's a really simple and a great piece to add to your home for spring.
The first DIY is a floral filled frame. I'm going to be using a frame from Dollar Tree, some fake flowers, Waverly Inspirations chalk paint, some pliers to cut my flowers, a hot glue gun, some paint brushes, and I'm also going to be using some reindeer moss from Dollar Tree. The first step is to take your frame apart, which I've already done, and now I'm going to be painting my frame with this Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in the color Ivory. I picked my paint up at Walmart, and I did have to do 2 coats of paint just to make sure that all of the underneath color was covered. Here I'm painting on the second coat of paint before I move on to dry brushing. Now that my frame's all dry, I'm going to be taking this Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in the color Truffle, and I'm going to be dry brushing that over top of the frame to give it a more aged, distressed look. And to dry brush, you're just going to dip your paintbrush in some paint, not a lot, and then you're going to take the excess off on some paper towel as much as you can so that there's barely any paint on your brush, and then you just brush over the frame. Now that my paint's all dry, I'm putting my frame back together. I'm only using the cardboard back piece, I'm not using the glass. And now I'm just cutting off all of the flowers from their stems that I'm going to be gluing on to this cardboard backing. I'm using my hot glue to glue my flowers into place on this cardboard back piece, and I'm starting out by using these white roses, which you'll see in just a minute that I ended up not using. I ended up pulling them off because I wasn't liking how large they were, but I am keeping the green flowers that I'm gluing on here. It's really easy to do. You just put the hot glue in place of where you want your flower, place the flower on there and hold it for 1 second so that it dries and your flower is where you want it to be. As you see here, I've torn off the white roses and I'm just continuing to glue on some of these green flowers with my hot glue gun. Again, just putting the hot glue on this cardboard piece and then placing my flower over the hot glue to hold it into place. Next, I'm going to be using this reindeer moss that I picked up from Dollar Tree, and since I kept most of my flowers in the middle of the frame, I'm going to be placing my reindeer moss all around the edges of the flower and a little bit in between some of the flowers in the middle, just so that you can't see any gaps. The reindeer moss can be a little messy, so just keep that in mind if you're going to be using it for any of your future projects. But I'm really happy with the way that this turned out, and I'm so glad that I took those white roses off and decided to use the moss. Without including paint, this project only took me 30 minutes to do and a little less than $3 to make, and now I'm going to be moving on to DIY number 2. Moving on to DIY number 2, tiered terracotta pots. I'll be using the terracotta pots, some flowers, the Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in ivory and truffle, some pliers to cut my flowers, and a paintbrush. The first thing I'm doing is I'm going through and painting all of my saucers and terracotta pots with the Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in the color ivory. I use this color chalk paint in a lot of my videos. I just love this color so much. This chalk paint dries really fast, especially on these pots and saucers, so by the time that you're done painting one thing, the other one is already dry. It makes the project go a lot faster. I did end up doing 2 coats of this paint on all of the pots and saucers. When I painted the inside of this pot, I only went about a quarter way down on the inside because you're not going to see the inside, so I wasn't worried about having the entire thing painted. Next, I'm taking this Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in the color Truffle, and I'm going to be dry brushing it all over the saucers and the terracotta pots. To dry brush, once again, you just dip your paintbrush in a little bit of paint, and then you're going to take off the excess on a paper towel so that there's hardly any paint left on your brush, and then you're going to take the paintbrush over the surface of the white and just dry brush that brown color all over the white. And I'm focusing on the edges and anything that sticks up so that it looks more aged and distressed. When I dry brush, I don't really have any kind of special technique. I just like to go in all different directions with my brush so that it gives it a more natural aged look. Also, when you're dry brushing, you don't want to apply any pressure to your brush. You just want to swing your brush back and forth, up and down, with hardly any pressure at all. Now I'm going to be assembling my tiers. I'm placing the largest saucer on the bottom with the largest pot flipped upside down on top, and then I'm continuing that step with the smaller saucer and the smaller pot, and I'm putting the smallest saucer on the very top. And now I'm just going to be cutting all of my spring florals and then bending the branches a little bit so that they go around the pot. And I'm going to be continuing that step for each tier. I chose not to attach my pots to my saucer with any kind of glue, but if you wanted to do so, E6000 works really great for that. I picked up my spring florals at Walmart and they were only 97 cents a piece, and to me these look very realistic for only 97 cents. I chose to use this decorative bird on the top. I already had him laying around in my house, so I didn't have to purchase him, but I really like the way that he looks on the top of the tiers. And if you wanted to do just florals, you could do that as well, or any kind of figurine that you'd like. The first DIY, I'm going to be making some bird's nests in these terracotta pots, and I'm going to be using the pots, some paint brushes, paint, some jute, my hot glue gun, some brown and green moss, as well as these fake robin's eggs. And I'm going to be taking this Waverly Inspirations chalk paint in the color ivory, and I'm just going to be painting this with one coat over these terracotta pots. And I picked these pots up at Target in the dollar spot, but you can get them at your local craft store, or even Walmart or Dollar Tree have them as well. And I'm just going to be making sure that it's covered, but not like completely a thick coat over it, because I still want to see some of that terracotta color coming through. Now I'm going to be taking this Art Minds chalk paint in the color Espresso, and I'm just going to be dry brushing this onto the pots that I painted in the ivory color, and I'm just making sure that there's hardly any paint on my brush, so that when I'm dry brushing over the pots, that it's coming off in places that I want it to when I press harder with my brush, but I also want to still be able to see that ivory color, just so that the pots have more of like a distressed, dirty look to them. Next, I'm going to be taking this jute and wrapping it around the underneath lip part of these pots, and I'm going to be doing that with my hot glue gun, and I'm going to be wrapping it around about 3 times. And I like this because it gives it more of a farmhouse, rustic look. You can totally leave the pots as is without doing this, but I really like the look of the jute. Now I'm going to be taking this brown and green moss that I picked up from Dollar Tree, and it does come in 2 separate packages, but I had already mixed mine, and I'm just going to be placing that into the pots, and then simply placing these robin's eggs that I picked up from Hobby Lobby and just placing them on top of the moss, and that's it for this DIY. DIY number 2 is a pedestal birdhouse, and I'm going to be making these by using a unfinished candlestick and an unfinished birdhouse that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, as well as some jute and my hot glue gun. And I'm just starting out by painting the unfinished wood with some chalk paint. I'm painting painting my birdhouse in 3 different colors, and I'll have all of those listed down below. You can definitely skip this step and get a birdhouse that's already finished. They are inexpensive, but I did have all the paint at home, so I figured I would just go ahead and paint my own. Here I'm just touching up a few spots that I missed the first time around and making sure that everything's covered. Here I'm just going to be adding some jute around the bottom edge of the birdhouse using my hot glue gun. I thought the birdhouse was a little plain and wanted to add just a little bit of something extra, plus it adds a little bit of that farmhouse vibe that I like so much. I'm going to be adding some jute to the little peg of the birdhouse, and I'm just going to be doing that by using my hot glue gun once again and putting a little bit of glue on the peg and then wrapping the jute around so that it sticks to the peg. This part was a little tricky for me, and it did take me a few times to get it just right. For the last step, I'm going to be attaching the birdhouse and the candlestick with my hot glue gun. I'm just going to be putting the hot glue around the base of the candlestick and sticking on the house. You could use E6000 for this as well. DIY number 3, I'm going to be making a spring wreath using a grapevine wreath, some cutters, and these flowers, which I believe are forsythia flowers. And I'm just going to be taking sections of those flowers and then placing them in and out of my grapevine wreath, just making sure that they're attached well so they don't fall out. I'm making sure everything's attached really well by sticking the branches of the flowers down in between the grapevines and then working the flowers in between the grapevines as well. And I highly suggest using floral cutters for this. I could not find mine anywhere, so I kind of had to just work with what I had.
And that was it for today's Mega Spring video. I hope you enjoyed all 23 projects. I would love to hear in the comments down below which DIY from today was your favorite. Thank you so much for watching.